Australia is a safer place not having Neil Prakash here. Mr Prakash was intimately involved in the operation of ISIL in the Middle East. He was somebody who had been very prolific in relation to sending out messages of propaganda. In the end, Mr Prakash is a terrorist, a murderer, and Australia is safer him not being in our country. The Australian government now has, through the legislation that we passed only a couple of years ago, seen 12 people renounce their Australian citizenship through their own actions or because of their conviction or because of their conduct. We want to make Australia a safer place. We don't want terrorists on our shores, and wherever possible we should push that threat out beyond our shores. Mr Prakash obviously is facing a lengthy jail term in Turkey. There are other countries who are interested, as I understand it, in relation to him and his activities in the Middle East, but people should recognise that if given the opportunity, Mr Prakash would harm or kill Australians, and our country is a safer place for him having lost his Australian citizenship, and it should serve as a very timely reminder to other people who are involved here in our country or abroad that the Australian government will not tolerate this level of threat in the Australian community. We're doing whatever we can to keep the Australian public safe, particularly over Christmas in the New Year period. We want people to be alert, and if there are any issues that they might identify at a shopping centre or elsewhere, they should notify authorities as quickly as possible. The Australian Federal Police, the state policing agencies, ASIO work day and night to keep Australians safe, and by having Mr Prakash in a situation through his own actions where he's lost his Australian citizenship, Australia is a safer place because of it. Well, obviously there's a process to go through, and we need to abide by the laws that are in place. We need to have natural justice where it applies. We need to have proper notice given. There is a process that needs to be gone through, and we've gone through each of those steps, and it's very clear that he has no allegiance to our country. He would kill Australians given the opportunity, and it's better for all of us that he now won't return to our country. Well, let's wait and see what the future holds for him, but hopefully he won't see the light of day for a long period of time to come. The fact is that he has been central to the ISIL effort in the Middle East. He's a very dangerous individual, and if he was back in our country, my judgment is, the judgment of our authorities here is that he would seek to do harm to Australians, and I think it's a good thing for our country that he is now a lesser threat than he would have been otherwise. Well, I can tell you one thing, I won't be taking national security advice from the Greens or from the Labor Party for that matter. Mr Shorten was in a government that never introduced legislation that stripped terrorists of their Australian citizenship, and this government now has 12 individuals who have, through their own actions or via the legislation otherwise, have given up, surrendered, renounced their Australian citizenship, and we're a safer country today than we were 5-10 years ago in that regard. The fact that those people now won't pose a threat to the Australian public, and we're working through each individual case where we see a threat, where we have returning foreign fighters, not just in our country but obviously in the Southeast Asia region. We're working very closely with partners because we know that, for example, 1 million Australians will holiday in Indonesia each year, particularly in Bali, etc., and we know the threat that is there, that's in Europe, in the United States and elsewhere, including in our own country. So we live in very difficult times, but the Greens have always been very weak on any issues in relation to border security, national security, law and order issues, and I think you'd be well advised not to take any advice from them. Well, the way in which the legislation operates, it can't render somebody stateless, so they need to have Australian citizenship and citizenship of another country. So we don't render people stateless, but we work with our countries in our region, with our Five Eyes partners and much further afield than that, to identify threats, to gather the evidence or the intelligence in relation to individuals or cells, particularly those that might have reached back into Australia from the Middle East, trying to plan an attack here. As you know, last July there was an attempt to smuggle an explosive device onto an A380 flight out of Sydney bound for the Middle East. Hundreds of people would have lost their lives had that been successful, and obviously ASIO and the other agencies have been able to thwart now 14 attempted attacks. So the threat is very real, but we have legislation that we abide by, and the message here is very clear to people that would seek to do harm to Australians. We will cancel passports. We will make sure that you can't hold your Australian citizenship if you've been involved in terrorist activities or a member of a terrorist organisation. We don't want that threat present in our country. We have enough people to worry about at the moment, given the current threat level, and the reality is that this is not going away. These people are dangerous criminals, they are murderous thugs, and we don't want terrorists in our country. Well, let's wait and see what happens in terms of the legal process, but from my perspective, I want Australians to be as safe as humanly possible. And I'm very glad, frankly, that now roughly 100 people who went from Australia to fight in the Middle East have been killed in the Middle East. They were involved with ISIL, they were a part of terrorist plots or attacks on people in the Middle East, in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. And we've seen the way in which they act out in Bali, in Paris, in the United States and elsewhere. I want to do whatever I can to keep Australians safe, and if we can prevent somebody from coming back to our shores, then that's the best possible outcome. Some people ask, why do we allow some of these people to go, or why don't we allow all of them to go? Other people would argue. The reality is that Australian citizens have a constitutional right to come back to Australia, and that's why this legislation is very important. It doesn't render people stateless, but it does say to them, you don't have an allegiance, you've broken your allegiance with Australians, and it's clear to us that you want to harm or kill Australians, and I'll do whatever I can to neutralise that threat. And we need to be realistic about the threat that we face in our country. People would seek to conduct a mass terrorist attack in our country tomorrow if they had the means and wherewithal, and we need to make sure that our agencies, as they are, work every day and night to keep us safe. There are a number of other cases that we're looking at the moment, and obviously other cases that are under review. It depends on the amount of evidence or intelligence that might be gathered in relation to a particular individual. So there's a lot of work that goes on with our partners in the coalition in the Middle East, and that work will continue as you would expect. And there's obviously new evidence that might arise as a result of somebody being under a current investigation or an intelligence holding that's been discovered out of a country elsewhere in the world. So yes, I mean, we're looking at cases all the time and trying to find ways, as I say, in which we can keep Australians safe.